midnight over the South China Sea. 4 F-35 Lightning, 2 fighters from the 34th Fighter Squadron, were already at 25,000 feet, running in total electronic silence. This was not a routine freedom of navigation flight. Their internal weapon bays were heavy, with 8 GBU-39 Small Diameter Bombs each, and their transponders had been dark for 3 hours. A single misplaced radio transmission or a stray radar pulse would betray their position to the massive sensor net stretching from the mainland to the Spratly Islands. The humid air outside the cockpits was thick with the scent of salt and the faint, metallic tang of ozone, while the moon cast a cold, silver light over the endless black waves below. Beneath the wings of the lead aircraft, the sea was a void of absolute darkness, hiding the hundreds of vessels that patrolled these disputed waters every single night. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Vance, callsign Viper 1, checked his head-mounted display, the green glowing symbology projected directly onto his visor. The 4 aircraft were flying in a staggered trail formation, separated by 3 miles of empty air to minimize their collective radar cross-section. They were currently 350 miles west of the Philippines, closing the distance to their primary objective at a steady speed of 540 knots. To any civilian radar, the 4 stealth jets were invisible, ghosting through the atmosphere with the radar signature of a small bird. The pilots sat encased in carbon fiber and glass, their bodies pressurized by G-suits that felt like a tight, constant embrace against their legs and abdomens. The mission profile, designated Operation Silent Hammer, called for a precision strike at coordinates 11 degrees 7 minutes north, 114 degrees 4 minutes east. The geopolitical landscape of the South China Sea had reached a critical and dangerous flashpoint in the spring of 2026. For over a decade, the international community had watched as submerged reefs were transformed into massive concrete fortresses, but the events of the last 72 hours had moved the region from a cold standoff to the brink of a hot war. The specific provocation occurred when a battery of HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles on the island locked onto a Philippine transport aircraft. This was not a momentary electronic glitch, but a sustained, aggressive painting of a non-combatant target that lasted for nearly 6 minutes. It was a clear signal of intent, a declaration that the skies over these international waters were no longer free for transit. The United States Indo-Pacific Command had been monitoring the rapid militarization of the reef with increasing concern. Intelligence photographs from high-altitude surveillance drones showed the arrival of 24 hardened aircraft shelters and a 3,000-meter runway capable of supporting heavy bombers. More importantly, the installation now housed a sophisticated electronic warfare suite and deep magazines for anti-ship cruise missiles. This single outpost, built on what was once a quiet coral reef, now possessed enough concentrated firepower to threaten any vessel or aircraft within a 200-mile radius. It was a dagger pointed at the throat of one of the busiest maritime trade routes in the world, where 1/3 of global shipping passes every single year. In Washington and Honolulu, the consensus among the Joint Chiefs of Staff was unanimous. The red line had been crossed when the Chinese garrison began interfering with the lawful movement of sovereign aircraft in international airspace. The White House issued a final diplomatic warning, demanding the immediate deactivation of the missile batteries and the withdrawal of offensive strike aircraft from the island. The response from the mainland was a defiant increase in military activity, including the deployment of 2 Type 55 destroyers to the waters surrounding the reef. The message was clear. The island was DAT, a sovereign fortress, and any attempt to challenge its authority would be met with overwhelming force. The United States 7th Fleet was already in motion. The Carrier Strike Group, led by the nuclear-powered USS Abraham Lincoln, moved into a holding pattern 250 miles east of the target. This position was carefully chosen to keep the carrier outside the immediate engagement envelope of the DF-21 Delta anti-ship ballistic missiles, while remaining close enough to launch a sustained air campaign. On the flight deck of the Lincoln, the tempo of operations had reached a fever pitch. Ordnance crews worked in the humid, salt-heavy air to move hundreds of precision-guided munitions from the lower magazines to the waiting aircraft. The smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid was omnipresent, a sharp chemical reminder of the looming conflict. The strategic objective of Operation Silent Hammer was not the total occupation of the island, but the surgical removal of its teeth. The primary targets were the high-frequency radar arrays that provided the eyes for the missile batteries and the command and control center that coordinated the island's defenses. Without these nodes, the HQ-9 missiles would be blind, and the airfield would become a useless strip of concrete. The mission required a level of precision that only the fifth-generation F-35 could provide, using its stealth characteristics to penetrate the most dense integrated air defense system in the Pacific. Beneath the geopolitical maneuvering and the high-level strategy, there was a visceral sense of tension among the sailors and pilots of the fleet. They knew that a single mistake could ignite a global conflict between two superpowers. The air in the ready rooms was thick with the scent of coffee and the quiet intensity of final mission briefings. Pilots studied the topography of the reef, memorizing the exact location of every radar mast and every satellite dish. They were the tip of the spear, the chosen instrument of national policy, tasked with enforcing a boundary that had been drawn in the sand, and reinforced with the weight of the United States military. As the 4 F-35 fighters of Viper flight closed the final miles toward their objective, the weight of this history sat heavily on their shoulders. The South China Sea was no longer a place of gray zone competition. It had become a combat theater. The silver light of the moon reflected off the dark water, illuminating a battlefield that was as beautiful as it was deadly. Every sensor on the aircraft was now focused on the red line that had been crossed. The order to engage had been signed. The weapons were armed, and the window for diplomacy had slammed shut. In the darkness of the early morning, the United States was about to send a message that would be heard from the Spratly Islands to the halls of power on the mainland. 12:13 in the morning. The 4 F-35 Lightning II fighters were now exactly 70 miles from the target, closing at a ground speed of 580 knots. On the panoramic cockpit displays, the objective codenamed Dragon began to resolve from a blurry thermal signature into a sharp, three-dimensional wireframe model. The artificial island sat at coordinates 11 degrees 7 minutes north, 114 degrees 4 minutes east, a jagged diamond of reclaimed land and reinforced concrete that had been torn from the seabed and turned into a fortress. The air inside the cockpits was silent, save for the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen regulators and the faint, high-pitched whine of the avionics cooling fans. Outside, the tropical night was a wall of humid blackness, the sea below hidden by a layer of broken clouds that smelled of salt and impending rain. The heart of Objective Dragon was a 3,000-meter runway, constructed of high-strength basalt fiber concrete designed to withstand the weight of heavy strategic bombers and the heat of continuous fighter operations. Along the northern edge of the strip, the 24 hardened aircraft shelters were visible, each one a massive mound of earth and steel, capable of protecting a J-20 stealth fighter from anything short of a direct hit by a 2,000-pound bunker buster. To the southern end of the reef sat the primary command and control hub, a 3-story windowless block of reinforced masonry, topped with a forest of communication masts and satellite uplinks. The primary threat to the approaching American flight was the HQ-9 surface-to-air missile battery positioned on the island's western promontory. This system, consisting of 8 mobile transporter erector launchers and a high-altitude search radar, was the most lethal long-range air defense asset in the region. Each of the 32 missiles in the battery's immediate ready rack was the most lethal long-range air defense asset in the region, had a range of nearly 120 miles, and utilized an active radar homing seeker to track targets at speeds exceeding Mach 4. Supporting the HQ-9 was an AN/SPY-6 equivalent radar array, a massive phased panel system built into the side of a concrete tower that could track over 100 targets simultaneously. Adding another layer of lethality to the defense was the presence of a Type 55 destroyer, anchored in the deep water lagoon on the island's leeward side. This 12,000-ton vessel acted as a mobile extension of the island's sensor net, its own vertical launch system loaded with 64 long-range anti-air missiles. The ship's hull was a dark shadow against the turquoise water of the lagoon, its radar panels emitting a constant, invisible wash of electronic energy that searched the sky for any sign of an intruder. The F-35 pilots could see the ship's electronic signature on their threat displays, a pulsing red icon that moved slightly, with the gentle swell of the tide. The island was not just a defensive position, it was a regional logistics hub. Deep beneath the concrete surface lay massive fuel bladders containing over 2 million gallons of aviation kerosene and high-capacity magazines filled with anti-ship cruise missiles. A network of underground tunnels connected the various batteries and bunkers, allowing the garrison of 600 personnel to move undetected by overhead satellite surveillance. The air surrounding the island was thick with the smell of diesel exhaust from the heavy generators that powered the radar arrays, and the acrid scent of the sea salt spray that constantly battered the seawalls. For the pilots of Viper flight, the complexity of Objective Dragon was a tactical puzzle that required absolute synchronization. Every radar mast, every missile launcher, and every command node had been assigned a specific identification number in the mission database. The F-35 sensor fusion engine was currently comparing the real-time electronic emissions from the island against the pre-loaded intelligence data, confirming the exact locations of the primary targets. The mission was not merely to hit the island, but to perform a lobotomy on its command structure, severing the brain from the sting. As the distance dropped to 50 miles, the green glowing symbology on the pilot's visors began to flash, indicating that the target was now within the engagement envelope of the GBU-39 Small Diameter Bombs. The fighters remained in their stealth configuration, their internal bays closed tight to maintain their low observable profile. The electronic environment was becoming increasingly dense. The island's jammers were beginning to fill the air with static, attempting to blind the very sensors the Americans were using to guide their approach. But the F-35 was designed for this exact chaos, its computers filtering out the noise to find the clear, sharp signals of the enemy's most critical assets. Viper 1 adjusted his seat, the pressure of his G-suit, a constant reminder of the physical reality of the mission. He looked through the floor of his cockpit, the electro-optical distributed aperture system, allowing him to see the island, as if the aircraft's skin were made of glass. Objective Dragon looked like a glowing city in the middle of a graveyard, its lights reflecting off the dark, churning water of the South China Sea. In less than 10 minutes, those lights would go out, and the concrete fortress would be transformed into a blackened ruin of twisted steel and shattered glass. 12:13 in the morning, 100 miles north of the primary target. Two EA-18 Golf Growler electronic warfare aircraft from Electronic Attack Squadron 138 were already saturating the airwaves with a wall of digital noise. This was the invisible shield, the critical layer of protection that allowed the stealth fighters to move through the most heavily defended airspace in the world without being engaged. The mission of the Growlers was simple, but incredibly complex: to find every pulse of the enemy's radar and drown it in a flood of deceptive energy. The air inside the Growler cockpits was filled with the rhythmic humming of the ANALQ-99 jamming pods hanging from the wings, a sound that the pilots felt in their teeth as much as their ears. The electronic spectrum over the South China Sea was no longer an open highway. It was a chaotic storm of signals and countersignals, where the fastest computer would decide who lived and who died. High above the Growlers, at an altitude of 60,000 feet, 4 F-22 Raptor air superiority fighters from the 19th Fighter Squadron held a silent vigil. These aircraft were the assassins of the formation, tasked with ensuring that no Chinese interceptors could get within visual range of the strike package. The F-22 pilots were flying in the thin, freezing air of the stratosphere, where the sky was a deep, velvet black and the stars looked like cold diamonds. Their AN/APG-77 active electronically scanned array radars were operating in a low probability of intercept mode, scanning the horizon for the distinctive heat signatures of J-20 stealth fighters. The cockpit environment was clinical and focused, the only smell being the sharp, clean scent of bottled oxygen and the faint, rubbery odor of the pilots' flight suits. The synergy between the Growlers, the Raptors, and the approaching F-35 fighters was a masterpiece of modern military coordination. Using the Link 16 tactical data network, the Growlers identified the exact frequency and location of the HQ-9 search radars on the island. This information was instantly transmitted to the Raptors, who used their superior sensor suite to gate the targets for the strike flight. The F-22 acted as the quarterback of the engagement, seeing the entire battlefield from their high-altitude perch and directing the flow of the attack, without uttering a single word over the radio. The data flowed between the aircraft in microsecond bursts, creating a shared digital picture that was updated dozens of times every second. The Growlers were currently deploying their AN/ALQ-218 tactical jamming receivers, which could pinpoint the location of an enemy radar, even if it only emitted for a fraction of a second. As the island's defense systems attempted to lock onto the phantom targets created by the jammers, the Growler crews manipulated the return signals, making the American fighters appear to be 10 miles away from their actual positions. The electronic air was thick with noise, a blinding static that forced the enemy radar operators to turn up their gain, which only made them easier to track. The smell of hot ozone from the massive power draw of the jamming pods filled the rear cockpits of the Growlers, a physical manifestation of the invisible war being waged in the megahertz range. While the Growlers blinded the sensors, the F-22 Raptors remained ready to unleash their own lethal cargo. Each Raptor carried 6 AIM-120 Delta, advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles in its internal bays. If a Chinese fighter scrambled from the mainland or the island's runway, the Raptors would engage them from 50 miles away before the enemy even realized they were being hunted. The Raptor pilots sat in their reclined seats, their hands resting lightly on the side stick controllers, watching the tactical displays for any sign of movement. They were the ultimate insurance policy, a force of 4 jets capable of sweeping the entire sector of any aerial threat. The coordination extended back to the USS Abraham Lincoln, where the Tactical Air Control Center monitored the entire invisible shield in real time. The mission commanders watched as the red icons represent the enemy's radar search patterns began to flicker and waver under the pressure of the Growler's electronic assault. The shield was holding. The path to Objective Dragon was as clear as it was ever going to be. The air over the sea was a silent battleground where the weapons were. Not lead and steel, but bits and bytes. The Growlers provided the cloak, the Raptors provided the sword, and the F-35 fighters were the hand that would deliver the killing blow. Viper 1, leading the strike flight, saw the status of the electronic warfare support on his primary display. A series of green icons confirmed that the Growlers had successfully shuttered the primary search radar of the HQ-9 battery. The island was now effectively blind to the high-altitude stealth approach. Vance felt a surge of professional respect for the Growler crews. Their work was often unsung, but without them, the stealth of the F-35 would be far more vulnerable to the sheer power of the enemy's land-based arrays. The invisible shield was at its maximum strength, and the 4 strike fighters were now entering the final 20-mile run to the release point, 12:15 in the morning. The 4 F-35 Lightning II fighters reached the edge of the weapon release basket, exactly 22 miles from Objective Dragon. Lieutenant Colonel Vance pressed the red release stud on his right-hand side stick controller, and the internal weapon bay doors of the lead aircraft cycled open with a mechanical hiss that was masked by the roar of the slipstream. The cold, dry air at 25,000 feet rushed into the cavities of the jets, carrying the faint scent of hydraulic fluid and the ionized bite of high-altitude electricity. In the darkness of the bays, the pneumatic ejector racks fired with a rhythmic thud, punching the first 4 GBU-39 Small Diameter Bombs into the night air. Each 250-pound munition tumbled for a fraction of a second before its diamondback wings snapped open with a metallic click. The bombs transitioned instantly from dead weight to agile gliders, their onboard GPS and inertial navigation systems slaving to the coordinates of the island's primary radar arrays. Within 12 seconds, All 32 munitions from the 4-ship flight were in the air, forming a coordinated swarm of precision steel and high explosives. The F-35 bay doors snapped shut, restoring the jet's sleek, invisible profile as they banked hard to the north to begin their egress. Behind them, the swarm of bombs began a steep, silent dive toward the concrete fortress below, accelerating as they traded altitude for kinetic energy. The trigger was squeezed for the final time. The first wave of munitions shrieked toward the western promontory, where the search radar for the HQ-9 surface-to-air missile battery was operating at full power. The lead bomb punched straight through the protective fiberglass dome and the 6-meter-wide phased array panel inside, detonating with a focused blast of 100 pounds of high explosive. The impact was catastrophic. The massive radar tower erupted instantly. 6 tons of specialized electronics and structural steel shattered into 1,000 jagged fragments that were sent flying across the tarmac. A fireball bleached the sky white for 3 full seconds, illuminating the surrounding missile launchers as they were peppered by hypervelocity shrapnel. The primary command and control hub was the next to be hit. 4 GBU-39 bombs struck the roof of the windowless block in rapid succession. Their hardened steel noses driving deep into the reinforced concrete before the delayed fuses triggered. The pressure of the simultaneous detonations compressed every chest in the immediate vicinity, the shockwave blowing out the heavy steel blast doors and sending a pillar of gray dust and debris 200 feet into the air. Inside the bunker, the lights flickered and died as the main power cables were severed, leaving the garrison in a tomb of darkness and choking smoke. The sound of metal tearing and the deep, guttural roar of the internal explosions echoed across the lagoon. A detonation that cracked the eardrums of the sailors standing on the deck of the nearby destroyer. The side taking the hit did not stand still. On the southern end of the island, the Chinese garrison reacted with a mix of practiced discipline and sheer panic. Alarm sirens began to wail, their mechanical screams cutting through the sound of the secondary explosions. Crewmen in olive drab uniforms scrambled from their barracks, running toward the point defense systems as black smoke boiled out of the command center's ventilation shafts. The Type 55 destroyer in the lagoon began a desperate emergency engine start. Its funnel belching thick clouds of black diesel smoke into the humid night air as its own close-in weapon systems began to track the sky in a frantic search for the next wave of attackers. But the eyes of the island were gone. The radar screens and the missile batteries were filled with static and no signal prompts. Black smoke rose from the wreckage of the radar tower, a dense column that blotted out the stars. The burning pieces of the command center were still settling when the radio channels of the island garrison went silent for exactly 3 seconds, then erupted in overlapping voices, each one louder and more frantic than the last. The smell of burning oil, and something far worse, the chemical bite of vaporized electronics hung heavy over the runway. The first phase of the strike was complete. The island's long-range sting had been pulled, and the once mighty fortress was now a blind giant, bleeding fire and smoke into the South China Sea. The tactical results were immediate and devastating. Initial battle damage assessment from the F-35 sensors confirmed the total destruction of the search radar, 2 HQ-9 launchers, and the primary satellite uplink array. At least 42 enemy personnel were estimated killed or wounded in the initial blast, most of them specialized technicians caught inside the command hub. The Americans had achieved total surprise, turning a state-of-the-art military installation into a chaotic scene of fire and twisted metal. In less than 60 seconds, the silence of the midnight patrol had been replaced by the roar of a battlefield that was only beginning to burn. 12:16 in the morning. The final wave of 16 GBU-39 small diameter bombs dropped from the internal bays of Viper 3 and Viper 4, their glide wings deploying with a synchronized mechanical snap that vibrated through the carbon fiber airframes. These munitions were programmed for a high-angle terminal dive designed to maximize their kinetic energy before impact. The air over the reef was already a chaotic tapestry of white smoke trails, and the orange glow of burning wreckage but the most significant blow was still descending. The second wave split into two distinct groups, one targeting the massive underground fuel farm, and the other focused on the 12,000-ton Type 55 destroyer, still struggling to maneuver within the narrow confines of the lagoon. The first group of 8 munitions punched through the 3-meter-thick reinforced concrete lids of the primary fuel storage cells, the hardened steel noses of the bombs shearing through the subterranean armor like a hot needle through wax. The delayed action fuses triggered exactly 6 milliseconds after penetration, detonating inside the 2 million-gallon bladders of aviation kerosene. A colossal pillar of orange and black flame, rising nearly 400 meters into the night sky, erupted instantly, the force of the blast vaporizing the surrounding concrete and throwing a 4-ton refueling truck 60 meters into the churning water of the lagoon. The heat blast washed across the eastern side of the island with such intensity that the plastic components on nearby service vehicles began to melt and run like wax, while the temperature in the immediate blast zone rose to over 2,000 degrees. On the deck of the Type 55 destroyer, the 30mm close-in weapon system shrieked to life, spitting a stream of tungsten rounds at the sky in a desperate, automated frenzy. The sound was a continuous, bone-shaking roar that drowned out the screams of the crew. But without the primary search radar to guide it, the system was firing at shadows and ghost images created by the Growler's jamming. 3 of the American bombs found their mark, slamming into the ship's forward vertical launch system and the bridge deck. The impact was a symphony of destruction. The first warhead drove deep into the hull, severing the main power conduits and plunging the entire vessel into darkness, while the second and third tore through the superstructure, sending jagged fragments of steel and glass flying across the deck. The crew of the destroyer reacted with the frantic energy of men fighting for their lives in a trap. Sailors in white shirts and life vests scrambled across the listing deck, the gray paint peeling off the bulkheads in large, scorched flakes from the intense radiant heat of the nearby fuel fire. The ship began to take on a heavy list to the port side as water flooded into the ruptured engine room through a jagged 3-meter hole in the hull. On the island, the remaining members of the garrison abandoned their posts at the non-functional missile batteries, running blindly toward the concrete bunkers as the secondary explosions from the fuel farm sent a rain of burning kerosene and debris across the 3,000-meter runway. The discipline of the morning had been replaced by a primal, desperate scramble for survival. The lagoon was transformed into a cauldron of burning oil and churning white water, the once pristine turquoise surface now hidden beneath a thick, oily slick that carried the charred remains of the island's defensive perimeter toward the open sea. Black smoke, thick with the smell of burnt rubber and chemical propellant, rolled across the airfield, making it impossible to see more than 10 meters in any direction. The sound of the secondary detonations continued in a rhythmic, terrifying sequence, each one sending mate a new shockwave through the water that could be felt by the American pilots 5 miles above. The pressure from the primary blast had been so immense that it shattered every window in the barracks buildings, leaving the interior rooms littered with glass and the smell of ozone. At the edge of the burning island, the wreckage of the HQ-9 launchers continued to cook off, sending smaller interceptor missiles spiraling aimlessly into the sea like broken fireworks. The once sophisticated sensor towers were now nothing more than twisted, blackened skeletons of steel, their phased array panels melted into unrecognizable lumps of silicon and copper. The total destruction of the fuel farm ensured that the island's power grid was permanently severed, and the massive fire would likely burn for the next 48 hours. The strategic heart of the fortress had been obliterated, leaving only a smoking ruin where a state-of-the-art military installation had stood less than 10 minutes prior. Initial casualty reports, though fragmented, indicated that over 180 enemy personnel had been caught in the primary blast radius of the fuel farm and the command center. Another 60 sailors on the Type 55 destroyer were estimated to be killed or severely wounded as the ship's internal fire suppression systems failed. The American strike had been surgically precise and catastrophically effective, achieving a kill ratio that surpassed even the most optimistic mission projections. The hammer had fallen with absolute finality, and the silence of the deep Pacific was returning only to the areas not yet touched by the spreading fire. 12:18 in the morning. The sky over Objective Dragon was a chaotic tapestry of orange fire and white chemical smoke, but the defensive systems of the Chinese garrison were not yet entirely silenced. On the northern edge of the island, two Type 1130 close-in weapon systems, which had survived the initial bombardment due to their hardened concrete revetments, roared to life. These 11-barrel 30mm Gatling guns began spitting a stream of tungsten alloy rounds at a rate of 10,000 shots per minute. The sound was a continuous, bone-shaking vibration that cracked the nearby pavement and sent a rhythmic shockwave through the humid air, a mechanical scream that could be heard even over the roar of the burning fuel farm. The barrels of the guns glowed a dull, angry red in the darkness, and the smell of burnt cordite and hot grease filled the surrounding area. The defenders were firing blindly into the night, their primary search and track radars having been obliterated in the first 60 seconds of the attack. Without the precision of electronic guidance, the Type 1130 systems relied on local infrared sensors, which were currently being overwhelmed by the massive thermal signatures of the burning command center and the destroyed fuel bladders. Tracers arced into the black sky in frantic, desperate patterns, creating a dome of white-hot steel that searched for a target it could not find. The rounds hissed through the air, thousands of them falling harmlessly into the South China Sea 3 miles away, splashing into the dark water like a heavy metallic rain. From the shattered remains of the barracks, soldiers of the People's Liberation Army scrambled into the open, clutching QW-2 shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles. These men were coughing against the thick, acrid smoke that rolled across the runway, their eyes watering from the chemical bite of vaporized electronics. They knelt in the dirt and the debris of broken glass, pointing their launchers toward the fading roar of the F-35 engines. One soldier squeezed the trigger, and a missile shrieked off the rail, its small rocket motor kicking up a cloud of dust and sand. The weapon climbed steeply, its heat-seeking eye locking onto the massive infrared signature of the burning island behind it, rather than the stealthy, cooled exhaust of the American fighters. The missile self-destructed 3 seconds later, a small yellow flash, against the vast blackness of the ocean. On the listing deck of the Type 55 destroyer, the crew fought a losing battle against the encroaching fire. The ship's forward 30mm gun mount continued to fire, its automated logic circuits attempting to engage. The glinting fragments of the GBU-39 bombs that were still falling through the air. The vibration of the gun shook the entire hull, making it nearly impossible for the damage control teams to maintain their footing on the oily, blood-slicked deck. The heat from the nearby fuel farm was so intense that the sailors had to shield their faces with their arms. As they struggled to deploy fire hoses, the water from the pumps turned to steam the moment it hit the scorched bulkheads, creating a blinding white fog that added to the total confusion of the night. And the American pilots of Viper Flight, now 10 miles away and climbing to 30,000 feet, watched the light show in their rear-view cameras. To them, the island looked like a dying ember, flickering with the erratic pulses of its own defensive fire. The F-35 sensor suites continued to categorize each new threat, marking the locations of the remaining point defense guns for future reference. Vance could see the tracers passing thousands of feet below his flight path, a futile gesture of defiance from a blinded enemy. The electronic warfare support from the Growlers continued to pour static into the area, ensuring that any local radar that managed to reset would find only a wall of digital white noise. Beneath the tracers and the smoke, the garrison commander attempted to organize a secondary defense using handheld radios. But the signals were being jammed by the American electronic warfare aircraft orbiting to the north. The invisible shield was still in place, a suffocating weight that prevented any coordinated response. The few remaining trucks on the island, their windshields shattered and their tires melted, sat abandoned on the taxiways. The only sound on Bran, the island, other than the roar of the fires and the thunder of the Gatling guns, was the rhythmic, metallic clanging of a loose piece of sheet metal hitting a hangar door in the wind. The total lack of coordination among the defenders was a testament to the success of the initial lobotomy strike. Without their central command and the high-powered search radars, the individual batteries were nothing more than isolated pockets of resistance, firing at ghosts in a sky that belonged to the Americans. The smell of the sea, once a constant presence on the reef, was now entirely replaced by the stench of burning, kerosene, scorched rubber, and the heavy, metallic odor of spent ammunition. The defense was not a battle. It was a desperate, uncoordinated reaction to a disaster that had already occurred. By 12:21 in the morning, the last of the Type 1130 guns ran dry, its ammunition magazines exhausted after 4 minutes of continuous fire. The barrels continued to spin for a few seconds, a hollow metallic clicking that was the only sound left at the northern end of the runway. The soldiers with the shoulder-fired missiles lowered their launchers, their shoulders sagging with exhaustion and the realization that the attackers were gone. The island sat in a pool of its own blood and fire, a monument to the terrifying efficiency of fifth-generation aerial warfare. The defense had failed, and the only task left for the survivors was to wait for the sunrise to see. 12:22 in the morning. Objective Dragon was no longer a functional military installation. It had been transformed into a 3-kilometer-long thermal bonfire, visible to infrared surveillance satellites 500 miles above the Earth. The primary strike had been surgical, but the resulting secondary explosions were now systematic and catastrophic. Deep beneath the northern taxiways, the interconnected network of fuel lines and electrical conduits acted as a fuse, carrying the searing heat from the destroyed fuel farm toward the primary ammunition magazines. The air above the reef was thick with a heavy, oily soot that coated everything in a layer of black grime, smelling of high-octane kerosene and the scorched remains of high-grade industrial rubber. The first major secondary breach occurred at the hardened ammunition bunker located mid-island. The intense heat had caused the structural steel reinforcements within the concrete to expand and warp, creating massive fissures in the 3-meter-thick walls. At exactly 12:24, the internal temperature reached the flashpoint of the stored anti-ship cruise missiles. A magnesium-white flash erupted from the bunker's ventilation shafts, followed instantly by a detonation that sent a shockwave rippling across the entire reef. The explosion did not just destroy the building, it pulverized the surrounding area. Blocks of reinforced concrete into high-velocity projectiles that shredded the nearby hardened aircraft shelters. The sound was a deep, guttural roar that vibrated through the limestone foundation of the reef itself, felt as a physical blow by the survivors miles away. The 3,000-meter runway, the strategic centerpiece of the island, was now a useless strip of cratered basalt. The precision GBU-39 munitions had been programmed to strike the center line at 500-meter intervals, creating a series of deep, jagged heave craters that made any fixed-wing operations impossible. The heat from the burning fuel and munitions caused a phenomenon known as spalling, where the surface of the high-strength concrete literally exploded into razor-sharp flakes. The once smooth surface was now littered with twisted rebar, shards of aluminum from destroyed support vehicles, and unexploded submunitions from the island's own defensive batteries. To a pilot looking down from 30,000 feet, the airfield looked like a shattered mirror reflecting the orange glow of the surrounding fires. Inside the 24 hardened aircraft shelters, the devastation was equally total. Although designed to withstand external bombardment, the shelters had been breached by the secondary shock waves and the internal fires. 3 J-11 fighters, which had been undergoing maintenance during the strike, were now nothing more than blackened skeletons of titanium and composite materials. Their fuel tanks had ruptured early in the sequence, and the confined spaces of the hangars had turned into blast furnaces, melting the canopies and fusing the landing gear to the concrete floors. The smell of burning composites, a sweet, sickly chemical odor, mingled with the salt air and the persistent stench of burnt diesel. The island's primary desalination plant and power station, located near the southern lagoon, were also caught in the chain reaction. A rogue fragment from the Type 55 destroyer's forward magazine had punched through the power station's main transformer, causing a massive electrical arc that bleached the area in a blue-white light before the entire grid collapsed. Without power, the automated fire suppression systems in the remaining bunkers failed instantly. The silence that followed the electrical failure was brief, quickly replaced by the rhythmic whoosh of oxygen, feeding the massive fires and the occasional sharp crack of small arms ammunition cooking off in the armory. From the cockpit of Viper 1, Lieutenant Colonel Vance used his synthetic aperture radar to conduct a final battle damage assessment. The digital image on his screen was a graveyard of red and yellow thermal signatures. The radar towers were flat, the command center was a hollowed-out shell, and the lagoon was filled with a spreading slick of burning oil from the listing destroyer. The tactical significance of the island had been reduced to zero. It would take months, if not years, and billions of dollars in specialized construction to make objective Dragon flight capable again. The mission had achieved more than just neutralization. It had achieved the total physical erasure of the island's offensive potential. The atmospheric conditions over the reef had been permanently altered by the sheer volume of heat and smoke. A localized weather cell was beginning to form, driven by the intense thermal columns rising from the burning fuel farm. Rain began to fall through the smoke, a dark, acidic drizzle that sizzled as it hit the white-hot wreckage of the radar towers. This black rain carried the soot and chemicals of the battle back down to the concrete, coating the survivors in a toxic sludge. The roar of the fires was now a constant, low-frequency background noise, a funeral dirge for the multi-billion-dollar fortress that had been humbled in less than 15 minutes of combat. As Vance and his flight banked away, turning their noses toward the distant lights of the carrier strike group, the image of the burning reef lingered on their sensors. It was a stark reminder of the terrifying power of precision-guided warfare. The island sat in the dark expanse of the South China Sea like a cauterized wound, its lights extinguished and its voice silenced. The strategic objective had been met with a level of efficiency that was both professional and absolute. The United States had not just defended a red line, they had obliterated the hand that tried to draw it. 12:30 in the morning. 60 miles north of the burning ruins of Objective Dragon, the four F-35 Lightning II fighters were no longer ghosting through the dark at subsonic speeds. Lieutenant Colonel Vance pushed his throttle past the detent and into full afterburner, feeling the immediate, massive shove of the Pratt & Whitney F-135 engine as it dumped raw fuel into the exhaust stream. A 3-meter tongue of violet flame erupted from the tail of the lead jet, pushing the aircraft through the sound barrier with a physical thump that resonated through the pilot's carbon fiber seat. The airspeed indicator on his visor flickered rapidly upward. Mach 1.0, Mach 1.1, Mach 1.2. The fighters were now screaming through the thin, freezing air of the upper stratosphere, their leading edges heating up from the friction of the molecules even as the outside temperature sat at 60 degrees below zero. The egress was not a simple straight-line flight. Although the primary radars on the island had been neutralized, the mainland's integrated air defense network was now fully awake and aggressive. On his threat display, Vance saw the dreaded U symbol, indicating a Type 055 destroyer had emerged from the shadow of a neighboring reef 40 miles to the east and was now bathing the sky in high-frequency radar energy. Almost simultaneously, the ANALR-94 electronic warfare suite in his cockpit began a low, rhythmic chirping. A long-range HQ-9 missile battery from a secondary island installation had achieved a track-on-jam logic lock. A second later, the chirp turned into a steady, high-pitched scream. Viper flight, brake left. Go tactical, Vance commanded. His voice strained under the initial 4 Gs of the turn. The 4 stealth jets banked in unison, their vertical stabilizers biting into the thin air as they executed a high-speed descending spiral to beam the enemy radar. This maneuver placed the aircraft perpendicular to the incoming radar waves, utilizing the Doppler notch to disappear from the enemy's tracking computers. As they dove, the friction of the supersonic flight created a faint, ghostly glow around the cockpit canopy, a halo of ionized air that that only the pilot's night vision systems could detect. The air outside was a blur of dark indigo and silver moonlight, the stars above smeared into long white lines by the sheer velocity of the egress. The threat was real and kinetic. From the dark surface of the sea 40 miles away, two white streaks of fire ascended into the night. These were the booster stages of the HQ-9 missiles, accelerating to Mach 4 in less than 10 seconds as they climbed toward the American flight. Vance watched the missile icons on his display. They were moving with terrifying speed, their lead pursuit curves calculating a collision point in less than 45 seconds. The sweat on his forehead was now cold, stinging his eyes as he worked the side stick, his breathing heavy and rhythmic against the pressure of the oxygen mask. Viper 2. Deploy towed decoy, Vance ordered. His wingman tapped a command, and a small, fiber-optic towed decoy drifted out from a concealed compartment in the tail of the second F-35. The decoy immediately began emitting a massive electronic signature, making it appear 10 times larger and more attractive than the stealth fighters themselves. The incoming missiles, their onboard active seekers now searching for a target, latched onto the decoy's powerful signal. Vance watched as the two white streaks of light veered sharply away from the formation, chasing the electronic ghost into the empty sky. A few seconds later, two brilliant yellow flashes illuminated the horizon 20 miles behind them as the missiles detonated their half-ton warheads against the vacuum of the night. The shockwave from the distant explosions was too far away to be felt, but the light reflected off the silver skin of the fighters for a fraction of a second. Vance didn't wait to see the aftermath. He leveled the aircraft at 15,000 feet. The air thicker and more turbulent here, causing the jets to shudder violently as they maintained Mach 1.2. The smell of the cockpit had changed. The intense heat of the electronic systems and the high-output engine had created a dry, scorched metallic scent that filled the mask. He checked his fuel state. The supersonic dash had consumed nearly 3,000 pounds of JP-8 in less than 5 minutes. They needed to find the tanker, and they needed to find it soon. Behind them, the South China Sea was a hive of activity. The Chinese search radars were now sweeping the entire sector, but the invisible shield of the Growlers and the high-speed egress of the Viper flight had created a window of safety. The four fighters were now 150 miles from the target, moving further into the blue water where the USS Abraham Lincoln waited. The threat icons on the display began to fade from solid red to a flickering orange, indicating that the enemy was losing the track. The stealth coding, the electronic decoys, and the raw power of the supersonic engines had worked in perfect harmony to extract the strike team from the jaws of the Dragon. Viper 1 eased the throttle back, the violent roar of the afterburner dying down to a steady, powerful hum as the aircraft slipped back below the speed of sound. The transition to subsonic flight was smooth, the silence returning to the cockpit like a heavy blanket. Vance looked out at his wingmen, 3 jagged dark diamonds silhouetted against a sky that was finally beginning to show the first, faint hint of gray on the eastern horizon. The mission was not over, but the fire was behind them. The cold, salt-heavy air of the Pacific was waiting to welcome them back to the deck of the carrier. 12:45 in the morning, 200 miles east of the Luzon Strait and deep in the Philippine Sea, the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, CVN-72, was steaming into a steady 30-knot headwind, its massive hull cutting through 5-meter swells. The flight deck was a dimly lit, high-stakes theater of motion, where the air was thick with the smell of vaporized jet fuel and the sharp, stinging spray of the salt-heavy ocean. Sailors in colorful jerseys moved with practiced urgency, their goggles reflecting the faint red glow of the deck lighting, as they prepared for the recovery of the strike package. The carrier was the only island of steel in 1,000 miles of black water, a 330-meter platform that looked impossibly small from the cockpit of a descending fighter jet. 400 miles to the west, the fires of Objective Dragon were still burning, but for the pilots of Viper flight, the mission had shifted from combat to the most dangerous 5 minutes of their lives. Lieutenant Colonel Vance felt the cumulative weight of the 5-hour mission pressing into his spine, his neck muscles stiff from hours of scanning the horizon under the weight of his high-tech flight helmet. He checked his fuel state one last time. The supersonic dash had left him with 3,000 pounds of fuel, enough for exactly 2 attempts at the deck, before he would be forced to find a tanker or eject into the dark. He toggled his radio to the carrier's approach frequency, the static of the open ocean filling his ears. Lincoln approach. Viper 1. Flight of 4 F-35 Charlies, inbound for recovery. State 3.0. Vance transmitted, his voice sounding raspy and thin after hours of breathing filtered oxygen. Viper 1. Lincoln. Radar contact. Your signal is clear. Case 3. Recovery in effect. Descend and maintain 6,000 feet. Report reaching the Marshall Stack. The controller replied, the voice calm and professional. The 4 stealth fighters began their staggered descent, their sleek noses dipping into the layer of thick, tropical clouds that sat at 10,000 feet. Inside the cloud bank, the world disappeared into a gray, featureless void, the only reality being the glowing green instruments on the panoramic display. The F-35 Charlie variant, built specifically for the carrier environment with larger wings and heavy-duty landing gear, shuddered as it hit the turbulent air of the lower atmosphere. Vance focused on the needle of the tactical air navigation system, guiding his 25-ton aircraft toward the invisible point in space where the carrier was waiting. At 3 miles from the ship, Vance began the dirty-up sequence. He reached for the landing gear handle, feeling the 3 massive struts lock into place with a series of heavy mechanical thuds that vibrated through the airframe. The tailhook dropped with a metallic clatter, extending behind the aircraft like a desperate steel finger reaching for the deck. He engaged the precision landing mode, often called the magic carpet system, which used advanced flight control laws to automate the most difficult parts of the glide path. Even with the automation, the physical reality was daunting. The deck was pitching up and down 5 meters in the heavy seas, a moving target in a world of absolute darkness. Viper 1, 3/4 of a mile, call the ball. The landing signal officer commanded. Viper 1, lightning ball, 3.0. Vance responded. His eyes locked on the amber light of the optical landing system on the side of the deck. The final approach was a controlled crash. The F-35 followed the glide slope with digital perfection, its engine screaming at a high power setting, to ensure the pilot could climb away if the hook missed the wires. The ship looked like a tiny, flickering toothpick in the vast blackness. Vance gripped the side stick, his heart hammering against his ribs as the stern of the carrier rose up to meet him. 1 second he was over the churning white wake of the 4 propellers, and the next, the world exploded into a violent, neck-snapping jolt. The tailhook had snagged the number 3 wire, the thick steel cable yanking the jet from 150 knots to a dead stop in less than 2 seconds. The deceleration was a crushing force of 4 Gs, slamming Vance's head forward against his chest and pinning his arms to his sides. He jammed the throttle to full military power for a split second, a standard safety procedure in case the wire snapped before he felt the wire hold, and the aircraft settled onto the deck. He pulled the power back to idle, the sudden silence of the engine almost as shocking as the impact. Outside the canopy, a sailor in a yellow jersey signaled for him to raise the hook and clear the landing area. The smell of burnt rubber from the tires and hot hydraulic fluid filled the cockpit, the scent of a successful trap. As Vance taxied his fighter toward the finger at the edge of the deck, he watched his wingmen follow him down in 1-minute intervals. Each aircraft slammed onto the steel with the same brutal precision, their engines glowing orange in the dark before being guided into their parking spots. The 4 jets of Viper flight sat in a row, their jagged, stealthy silhouettes dripping with condensation and sea salt. The mission was physically over, but the adrenaline still surged through Vance's veins. He shut down the engine, the high-pitched whine of the turbine fading into the sound of the wind and the waves. He had left a fortress in ruins, and now he was home on the only piece of America that mattered in the South China Sea. 1 in the morning. The flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln was a scene of controlled, high-speed industrial activity. As soon as the 4 F-35 Charlie fighters came to a halt in their parking spots, They were swarmed by teams of sailors in colored jerseys, each color representing a specific, critical function in the carrier's logistical heart. The air was a thick, vibrating soup of heat, salt spray, and the overwhelming, sweet chemical smell of burnt JP-8 fuel. The sound of the wind whipping across the deck at 30 knots was punctuated by the rhythmic thump and hiss of the steam catapults still launching the next wave of combat air patrol. The red shirts, the aviation ordnancemen, were already moving. They operated with a systematic efficiency that made the movement of several tons of high explosives look like a choreographed dance. From the deep magazines located 6 decks below the waterline, heavy-duty elevators brought up fresh pallets of GBU-39 Small Diameter Bombs. Each weapon was a masterpiece of precision engineering, its white-painted casing reflecting the dim red floodlights of the deck. The crews used specialized hydraulic lifts to raise the 8 bomb racks into the internal weapon bays of the stealth fighters. Every bolt was torqued to an exact specification, and every data umbilical was checked twice to ensure the aircraft's computer could talk to the bomb's guidance system. There was no room for error. A single loose connection could mean a missed target or a catastrophic failure in the heat of combat. Simultaneously, the green shirts and brown shirts, the maintenance and plane captains performed a rapid but exhaustive inspection of the aircraft's skin. They moved with flashlights, their beams dancing over the gray, radar-absorbent material of the F-35. They were looking for any sign of bubbling or heat damage, caused by the Mach 1.2 dash away from the target. The stealth coating was the aircraft's primary defense, and even a scratch the size of a coin could increase the radar cross-section enough to be detected by enemy sensors. They checked the intake fans for bird strikes or foreign object debris, their hands moving over the composite surfaces with the familiarity of surgeons. The mechanical health of the fleet was maintained not just in the hangars, but here, on the spray-slicked steel of the flight deck in the middle of a black ocean. The grapes, or fuel crews in their purple jerseys, worked with massive, high-pressure hoses that pulsed with the flow of thousands of gallons of fuel. The USS Abraham Lincoln carried over 3 million gallons of aviation fuel, enough to keep the air wing flying for weeks of sustained combat. As the fuel flowed into the internal tanks of the fighters, the aircraft settled lower on their struts, gaining the weight needed for the next mission. The smell of raw kerosene was everywhere, a sharp, cold scent that cut through the humid tropical air. The fueling was a high-risk operation, performed just feet away from hot engine exhausts and spinning turbine blades, requiring a level of focus that few civilian jobs could ever demand. Below the flight deck, in the cavernous hangar bay, the logistics chain continued. Spare parts, from entire jet engines to tiny microchips, were being moved from the ship's internal supply warehouses. The carrier functioned as a self-sustaining city, capable of repairing almost any component of the air wing while thousands of miles from the nearest port. The mechanical efficiency was a force multiplier, ensuring that the 4 jets of Viper flight would be ready to launch again in less than 2 hours. This was the unseen strength of the armed forces, not just the fighters and the missiles, but the thousands of men and women who ensured those weapons were fueled, armed, and mechanically perfect. As the first hint of gray light began to touch the eastern horizon, the replenishment was nearly complete. The 4 F-35 fighters stood ready, their bays loaded with fresh munitions and their tanks full. The pilots, after a brief debriefing and a high-protein meal, were already catching a few minutes of sleep in the ready rooms. The deck of the Lincoln was quiet for a rare moment, the only sound being the waves slamming against the hull and the distant, muffled roar of a generator. The logistics of war were unglamorous and exhausting, but they were the foundation upon which the victory at Objective Dragon had been built. The hammer was being recocked, and the invisible shield was being replenished, ready for whatever the next 24 hours would bring. 8 in the morning on the 13th of January, 2026. The Pentagon press briefing room in Arlington, Virginia, was packed with journalists from every major international news agency, the air thick with the smell of floor wax and stale coffee. Rear Admiral Thomas Miller, the spokesperson for the Department of Defense, stepped to the lectern with a heavy, deliberate pace. He adjusted his glasses and opened a thick blue folder containing the first declassified satellite imagery of the South China Sea since the strike. Behind him, a massive high-definition screen flickered to life, showing a grainy but unmistakable infrared image of a blackened, smoking reef, surrounded by a dark, oily slick. The room went silent, the only sound being the rapid-fire clicking of camera shutters. At 00:15 hours local time, Admiral Miller began, his voice projecting a calm, professional authority. Elements of the United States Pacific Command executed a precision strike against the illegal military installation at coordinates 11 degrees 7 minutes north, 114 degrees 4 minutes east. This operation, designated Silent Hammer, was a direct response to repeated acts of aggression against sovereign Philippine aircraft in international airspace. Our primary objective was the neutralization of offensive missile batteries and the command and control infrastructure on the reef. I can confirm this morning that those objectives have been achieved with 100% success. The Admiral tapped a remote, and the screen zoomed in on the northern tip of the island. Initial battle damage assessment confirms the total destruction of the HQ-9 surface-to-air missile battery and its associated high-frequency search radars. The island's primary runway has been cratered at 500-meter intervals, rendering it incapable of supporting fixed-wing operations for the foreseeable future. Furthermore, the underground fuel storage facility, containing over 2 million gallons of aviation kerosene, was completely destroyed in a series of secondary explosions that lasted for nearly 6 hours. The strategic heart of the installation has been effectively removed. A reporter from a major network raised a hand, asking about the fate of the foreign military naval vessels in the area. The Admiral's expression remained neutral. The naval destroyer anchored in the lagoon sustained multiple direct hits from precision-guided munitions. The vessel suffered a catastrophic failure of its forward magazine and is currently resting on the seabed, in 30 meters of water. We estimate that 180 enemy personnel were killed or wounded during the engagement. Most of these casualties were technicians and specialized radar operators. I want to be very clear. The military forces took every possible measure to minimize the loss of life, while ensuring the total neutralization of the threat. The strategic implications of the strike were already rippling through global markets and diplomatic circles. By destroying the sensor net on the reef, the military forces had restored the freedom of navigation to one of the most vital trade corridors in the world. The red line that had been drawn by the Defense Headquarters facility was no longer a theoretical boundary. It was a physical reality reinforced by the charred remains of a multi-billion-dollar fortress. The Admiral emphasized that the military forces would continue to maintain a persistent presence in the region to ensure that no further attempts to militarize the international waterway would be tolerated. 5,000 miles to the west, the aircraft carrier was already moving into a new patrol sector. The flight deck was quiet now, the salt spray washing away the last traces of the night's activity. The 4 jet fighter aircraft of the strike flight were tucked away in the hangar bay, their jagged silhouettes looking like silent sentinels in the shadows. For the pilots and the crews, the mission was a successful execution of years of training and billions of dollars in technological investment. They had sent a message that was heard in every capital city. In the Pacific, the South China Sea would remain open, and the price of closing it was total and absolute. The morning sun finally rose over the South China Sea, illuminating the black, jagged scar where the reef installation had once stood. The smoke from the fuel fires had thinned into a long, gray smudge on the horizon, drifting slowly toward the west. There was no movement on the island's concrete surface, and no voices on the radio. The silence of the ocean had returned, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was the silence of a lesson learned, a boundary reset, and a superpower that had proven it still held the keys to the Pacific. The Silent Hammer had finished its work, and the world was left to contemplate the smoking ruins of a fortress that had tried to defy the sky. The military forces do not seek conflict, Admiral Miller concluded, closing his folder and looking directly into the cameras. But we will not hesitate to act. When the safety of our allies and the freedom of the seas are threatened, Operation Silent Hammer is over. The results speak for themselves. Thank you.